The very first thing I'd like to point out to you is right up there in the very beginning of the definition for what inflation is. The process of general increases in the average level of prices. So let's start right at the beginning. Inflation is not an event, it's a process. And it's a process that every one of us, every business, every government, every player in the economy, in a way, acquiesces into. Every single time you go to buy something, and it's more expensive today than it was yesterday, you have acquiesced to the concept of inflation. You became part of a process. But the same thing is true every time you accept a pay increase on your job. I don't know anybody who turns down pay increases when they're offered to us or given to us. But every time you accept a pay increase, and that pay increase is in percentage terms bigger than the percentage increase in the productivity you have given to your firm or store or business or government, wherever it is you work, you have acquiesced to the inflation process, but so too has your employer. Your employer was willing and able to pay you that higher amount. And so when we think of this as a process, we realize just how difficult it is to manage it. Because how do you manage a process where everybody is involved? If it involved a single company or a single sector or a single industry, we could focus on it. In the early 1960s, President Kennedy was concerned about the price of steel rising. And he called the CEOs of the major steel companies into his office and he said, you got to stop that. Steel is too important to the economy. You cannot raise steel prices. And the CEOs of all the major steel companies said, but we need the price increase. We have to have it. And Kennedy said, okay, then go ahead, raise prices. But none of you are going to be getting government contracts from me. Forget it. Either you're going to listen to me and not raise your prices, or you're just going to get any contracts from the U.S. government. I think they realized that the better course was to not raise their prices and keep the contracts. But that was focused on a specific industry. But when you're talking about a general increase in prices, where the prices could be for everything from the simplest piece of food, a piece of fruit, to the most complex piece of equipment that you could imagine, and everything between. It could be civilian, like food. It could be military, like an F-35 fighter plane. Doesn't matter. When you're dealing with all of these processes, it's very hard to deal with it, and it's a general increase in the average level of prices. So what does this mean exactly? It doesn't mean that the price of everything is going up. Some things may be going down in price. It doesn't mean that everything is going up at the same rate. Maybe some things are really inflating a lot. Like right now, the price of copper is at an all-time high level. It is just blown through the roof. Copper prices are extraordinary right now. But not everything has seen a massive increase in prices. Some things have gone up a little, some things have really gone down in price. So you're looking at a general increase in prices, and what you're looking at really is the average of all of that. Why does the Federal Reserve focus on a target of 2% inflation at an annual rate? Because they realize that some things go up a lot, some things go up a little, some things go down a little, some things go down a lot, but on average, they'd like to see it at 2%. And why do they not make it 0 as their target? Because if you make it 0, then you probably have a lot of things that are going down in price. And anybody who works in a business knows that for the most part, when you're in a business and you're seeing your prices falling, that's a danger sign. In order to keep your revenue going up, you got to keep increasing your sales. And you can't always do that. So that's the first distinction I'd like you to pay attention to. The word process, a general increase in prices, and you're looking at the average increase in prices, recognizing that some prices go up a lot, some a little, some go down a little, some go down a lot. So it's an average. The next thing, don't confuse inflation, which is a process of rising prices, with high prices. And as I point out in the first bullet point, a Maserati always had a high price. It's one of the most expensive cars in the world. Don't confuse that with inflation of car prices, because you only get inflation when the expensive price of that Maserati becomes even more expensive. It's the movement upward in prices that defines inflation. It's not whether something is relatively expensive or relatively inexpensive. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Okay? And of course, as I pointed out to you, inflation is all about acquiescence to higher prices, either paying them. Maybe your workers are saying, I need a pay increase, and you have to pay them. Or you going to the store and, as I said, paying more today than you paid yesterday. There's another distinction we make all the time between disinflation and deflation. A lot of people confuse these two words, so let's talk about what that is. Disinflation is a slowdown in the rate of inflation. So if at an annual rate, the average rate of increase in prices was 3% last year, and this year it is at 2%, down from 3% increase to 2% increase in prices, we are disinflating. Hey, prices still went up. They went up 2%, but they went up 2% instead of 3%. It's slower. It's sort of like being in a car. You were going 60 miles an hour, and you were going forward at 60 miles an hour. You put your foot on the brake, and now you're going forward at 40 miles an hour. You're still going forward. You're just going forward slower. As opposed to deflation, which is a process of general price decreases. This is not disinflation. This means you take the price level and you lower it. You went to buy something in general and it was $1, but today it's 95 cents. Or in general, prices were at a certain level, but in general now the level they're at is lower. We have deflated. The United States really has never had a sustained deflation. We've had a couple of instances with individual quarters where the price level fell, but we've never had multiple years of deflation except during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Deflation is very rare. Disinflation is common. Deflation is very rare. It's rare, but it's not impossible. So we could have individual quarters of a year where the price level may have fallen, but then it goes up the next quarter. So these are just simple definitions of what we mean by inflation, disinflation, and deflation, but it's very important to keep these distinctions in mind. Next, I want you to be aware of a slide that we will come back to again on Wednesday. It is a slide that is basically taught everywhere in the world, another one of those cases, and it's a slide that is often misinterpreted. I would argue that maybe one of the 5 or 6 most commonly stated statements in all of macroeconomics is the statement you see in red at the top. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Because people have come to believe this, and I'm one of them, by the way, because people have come to believe this, there has been some misinterpretation as to how you begin to forecast inflation. Because think about it now. How is it that the Fed right now is saying we're having trouble getting the inflation rate up when we're looking at the money supply growing at a rate over 20%? Over 20%. How could that be? If the money supply is growing and growing and growing, shouldn't we be getting a lot of inflation? And the answer is not necessarily. And that's where the misinterpretation comes from. People look at the growth of the money supply and they look at the inflation rate and they link them automatically with each other as though you have this automatic relationship between inflation and the money supply. Well, one of the things that we learned a while back was what Milton Friedman, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, said about inflation is partially true. inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon over the long term. So what do we mean by that? In Friedman's work with Anna Jacobson Schwartz, what they did was they basically postulated, can we find any 10-year period, just pick any 10 years, 1930 to 40, 1938 to 48, just pick a 10-year period, any 10-year period. Look at the amount by which the money supply went up. Look at the amount by which prices went up in the same 10-year period. And it's remarkable. They're very, very similar. Over that 10-year period, you look at it and you say, wow, that's incredible. The money supply went up by 40% and inflation went up by 42%. Next decade, inflation, money supply went up by 36%. Inflation went up by 35%. It's remarkable. It's almost the same over long time periods. But in the 1970s, a question was asked by folks in Congress who asked the question, well, that's really true. Empirically, over these long 10-year periods, that looks like it's true. The amount by which the money supply went up and the amount by which prices went up are almost mirror images of each other. But how does that help us forecast anything? I mean, if someone were to say to me, how do you use that to forecast the inflation rate next year? Just looking at the money supply next year that we think will happen and looking at what we think, therefore, what inflation will happen, doesn't work. There's no short-term relationship between money and inflation. And that's the work that Peter Berman and I did in the first book that we wrote together, which is a long time ago, in 1977, when we found a very clear, econometrically valid and stable relationship between growth in the money supply and inflation over a very short-term period. And what we concluded was, and again, this is going to get slightly complicated, so let's see if we could take it very slowly, and this will be the last work we do today. What we found was that there is what statisticians call a distributed lag relationship between money supply growth and inflation. So what does that mean? What is a distributed lag as opposed to a regular lag? So let's make it simple for a while and not look at 10 quarters. Let's look at 2 quarters. A simple lag, not a distributed lag, would be how I feel today in the first quarter of 2021 depends upon how I felt 2 quarters back, which would have been the third quarter of 2020. So how I feel in Q1 of 2021 depends upon how I felt 2 quarters back in Q3 of 2020. Notice the lag. Q3 of 2020, add 2 quarters, fourth quarter, first quarter, that's how I feel in February. How I will feel in the third quarter of 2021 will depend upon something that I did in the first quarter of 2021. Third quarter, feelings depends upon what I did in the first quarter of 2021. That is a simple lag. But we didn't use simple lags. We used distributed lags. So what does that mean? How I will feel in the third quarter of 2021 will depend upon what I do in the third quarter of 2021, what I do in the second quarter of 2021, and what I do in the first quarter of 2021. In other words, we're passing through all of the quarters. The relationship is distributed across time. There's no gap. So what we found was, if you want to see what the inflation rate will be in a particular quarter of the year, what you do is you look at the amount by which the money supply increased in that quarter and in each of the 10 quarters previous to that, 2.5 years. And if you do that, you can create an econometric relationship that works. And the beauty of this relationship was we found that that relationship between money supply growth today And each of the 10 previous quarters will determine the inflation rate today had one more component to it that is actually so consistent with the growth models. So that if you look at all of the growth in the money supply econometrically and subtract off the amount by which productivity went up during that same period, you'll be able to forecast inflation. Why does that work? Because the money supply gives people spending power. It gives them aggregate demand. What does productivity do? It gives you output. It gives you aggregate supply. So what we found was the long-term productivity rate was like minus 2.3% a year. You subtract that off whatever inflation you think you would get from 10 quarters worth of money supply growth, and you can forecast inflation. That's what we did. The final point to make, and we will repeat this again on Wednesday, is in the bottom sentence of this page, which is arguably one of the three most important things we will talk about the entire semester. And that is that what we learned from all of this is that no matter what conclusions you think you can make econometrically, here's the only statement you can make with absolute confidence. You cannot say with confidence, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But what you can say with confidence is that too much money supply growth, and we don't know what that means, for too long, we don't know what that means, results eventually, I don't know when that is, in higher rates of inflation, and I can't tell you how high that is. Notice what I just said to you. I hedged 4 different times. Too much money supply growth for too long will eventually result in too much inflation. And the reason why every piece of that is hedged, the reason why I underlined 4 different pieces of that sentence, is that it all depends. It depends how strong the economy is. It depends on inflation expectations. It depends what the Fed is doing. It depends upon flows in the financial markets. It depends on fiscal policy. And what we conclude from this is that the relationship between money and inflation is a long-term relationship, maybe as much as 2.5 years. It's variable. Sometimes it's 2.5 years, sometimes it's 2 years, sometimes it's 1 year, and it's highly uncertain. It's variable, it's long-term, and it's uncertain. Yeah, your question.
A few classes ago, you said that if, like, during the second half of the pandemic, like right now, if the labor force, or not the labor force, like if we had like an economic growth spurt just now due to the stimulus, if we were able to have it more than the sustained amount, that would lead to inflation. Is that this idea?
Wonderful question. Thank you so much for it. As we will see on Wednesday in one of the slides, you are anticipating where I'm going, and you're absolutely correct, Famia. One of the things that we look at when we try to think about where inflation is going is the gap or the spread between sustainable real economic growth, which is the growth of productivity plus the growth of the labor force, the question you had on your exam, the gap between that and actual real economic growth. When actual real economic growth is above the sustainable rate for an extended period of time, almost always you get more inflation. So you were quoting me correctly, and you are spot on with your question. And what we will do on Wednesday, we will look at 3 or 4 different ways in which we look at inflation to try to figure out where it's going. And that's one of them, is that spread between sustainable real economic growth, productivity growth plus growth in the labor force, and actual real economic growth. And when the actual growth rate is above the sustainable rate for a long period of time, it means there's too much aggregate demand. You tend to have an inflationary period. Thanks for your question. It's a beauty. It was a very good question.
Professor?
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so over the past year, the money supply has increased and productivity has decreased. So would that spread just be even bigger because of Corona? And would we
Yes.
expect inflation because of that?
Yes, and that's why so many people in the marketplace are saying we're setting ourselves up for much more inflation. You got it exactly right. And then on top of it, you're going to add a stimulus package where you're going to give people in households where you have two people each earning less than 75,000, so they could be earning as much as 150,000, and you're going to give them each $1,400, and then you're going to give them each month a $300 child care credit. How much spending power are you going to create? I'm reporting to you now what people in the market are saying. I'm not necessarily expressing my point of view, which I won't get into. And so in light of your question, yeah, there's a lot of people who are really worried about it. There are many, however, who are saying, okay, slow down, slow down. We're already buying tons and tons of goods. The next thing is for us to start buying services. Well, it's one thing to stock up on goods. You can store them in your pantry. You can open up your refrigerator and put them in if you want. Services don't work that way. You don't go to, just because you have a little extra money, you don't go take a haircut every day, which is a service. And you don't sign up for college classes every day. And you don't take a cruise, and you don't get on an airplane, and you don't dry clean your clothing every day. So services are not the same. And that's really where the lag has been. The lag has been in services spending. And therefore, those who are not that worried about inflation are saying, you know what, we've built in goods inflation. That's why copper prices have shot up the way they have. That, and because we're building a lot of houses. But you know what? Services inflation isn't going to be that big. And on top of it, you talked about productivity. A lot of people are going to be coming back to work. We're going to be adding a lot of productivity because we're bringing people back to work. They're not coming back to work to sit there and do nothing. They're coming back to produce an output. So this is the argument. And we'll explore all of this on Wednesday. The reason I'm stopping now is it's already 12:03, and I know your class is over, and some of you have other classes. So let me stop here. Thank you to the 71 of you who joined, which I think is wonderful. I will print out all of your exams after I eat lunch. I'll grade them this afternoon, but I'm not going to post anything until I'm sure I have all of the exams, and I've got to make sure that I don't do anything that discourages or encourages people who are taking the exam on Wednesday. So don't look for your grades anytime in the next 48 or 72 hours or so. Just relax. They're not going to be there. I will eventually post all of your grades for you to see, and we'll go over the exam next week. Okay. Thanks, folks. Have a great day.
Perfect. Oh my.